Good afternoon. I'm Ruth Hussey, and I'm Chief Medical Officer for Wales. I welcome you to the second of 3 online seminars with international speaker and author, Dr. Jack Silverton, on the subject of Doctors Championing Change. I should also say that I will sound a bit croaky. That's because I'm recovering from a virus infection. And I also have to say that I will leave just a few minutes before the end of the session, and Alan Wilson will wrap up at the end, and I'll just hand over to him at the very end of the session. So, when I was appointed as Chief Medical Officer, there were several areas that people were very keen for me to look at, and clinical leadership was absolutely top of the list, so I'm delighted that we're talking about this today. I have to say also was a real desire and a determination to make a real difference to health outcomes in Wales, and I know an aspiration that's shared by all of us. So this focus on clinical leadership is crucial to our ability to bring about real change. In the first seminar, Jack examined some of the reasons doctors may feel reluctant to engage. In today's seminar, he will explore how to build trusting relationships and developing a shared vision to support doctors in taking the lead on improving healthcare systems. The session will also consider the role of chief executives and the board in this area. These seminars have been arranged by 1,000 Lives Plus in Wales National Healthcare Improvement Programme, and we're delighted that every health board and trust in Wales is represented. Some organisations have joined the call as hubs, providing a great opportunity to listen and learn together. The format for today includes 2 opportunities for a question and answer session with Jack, and that will be a really important opportunity to hear more from you. Please can you use the Q&A section on the WebEx to send us your comments and questions during the session. You can also tweet them using the hashtag 1000lives. You can share your comments as the session develops by entering them in the Q&A panel. If you're in a large room, please signal to your coordinator so that they can type in your questions in good time. We will not be asking you to speak online. Instead, your questions and comments will be fed to me and for me to put to Jack. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And just to get us warmed up and used to using the WebEx, we have 2 questions for you. One, just a housekeeping one, and a second one in terms of the materials for today. So the first question, if you're all ready, is, did you attend the first Doctors Championing Change session last month? Please submit your answers. Okay, we'll move on to a second question. I think we'll get the results of the questions in a minute. So we'll move on to the second question now, which is, how familiar are you with the evidence on gaining clinician engagement? So just an assessment really of your baseline awareness and knowledge of the evidence around this. So coming up on screen are the choices of questions. A, very familiar. B, familiar. C, not familiar. For those of you in a hub, you'll have to come to a very quick consensus about what your general answer will be to that one. We'll just wait a few seconds to allow you to express your vote. We should have the results coming up in a minute now. So if you bear with us, we'll see the answers, and then we'll get going on Jack's presentation. So hopefully you're starting to feel familiar and confident with the process. There's a chance to have a go at this. Are we ready to see the results?
In the house.
There we go. So these are the results to the first question. So we have almost half of you who are part of the first one, so welcome back. and welcome to those who've joined for this second session. We'll do a little bit of recapping, so we'll be in the same place as we go through. And for the second question, we'll just wait for the results of the second question.
Only 17 people responded. You think?
No, we're still waiting for the second question. So, oh, there we go. I think a really good spread of people some who expert knowledge and some who not very familiar. So, Jack, that gives you a flavour of the starting point for the session today. So without any further ado, I'd like to formally introduce Jack. It gives me great pleasure to say that Jack Silversim is a graduate of the Harvard University School of Dental Medicine, where he now serves as a member of the Faculty of Medicine. He's a widely recognised speaker on doctors and change and a regular presenter at IHI conferences and other international events, including the UK's annual Patient Safety Conference. He's also co-author of Leading Physicians Through Change. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. I'm delighted he joins us from the city of Cambridge in Massachusetts in the US, and it's over to you. Thank you, Jack.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I'm really moved by the fact that we've got representation from all the trusts, so I hope what I provide will really be useful to all of you. I did want to start off today just spending a few minutes in this first part of this session just recalling a few of the key points, particularly now that I know that about half of you weren't with me the last time. And then I want to move on to new material, which is really talking about the importance of shared vision among the doctors and with administration of an institution if we're really going to get the doctors to engage in quality improvement. So I want to talk about that. Then we're going to take a little break for some Q&A, and then we'll come back and have a second session, which at that point we'll really talk about the importance of clinical leadership and how to make it effective toward the cause of improving quality. So just to review for a moment here, when we talked about the barriers to engagement last time, we talked about there really are barriers on both the manager's part and on the clinician's part. For the managers, oftentimes they have a different definition of engagement than doctors might. And they wonder if I'm asking doctors for input, is that the same as really handing over control? And they offer and under pressure for timely decisions, which makes the lengthy process which doctors might choose to go through, oftentimes looking for consensus, very difficult for them to have patience to wait for that. And so if with little or no success with an efficient process, with doctors really feeling that they were adequately engaged, oftentimes there is a sense of kind of why bother. On the doctor's part, from experience, they've often become cynical that their input makes any difference and that their input tends to go into a black hole. They're reluctant to delegate authority for anyone to speak for them, and so they all want to have their point of view heard by the ultimate decision maker. They've got, certainly today, they have many demands on their time and attention, and so if it's not going to be a sincere return on that investment of time, they're going to probably opt out. And then, and then of course, if I do get involved, we make a decision, and somebody who was not involved says, well, I'm not going to bother to do it the new way, then those who were involved say, why bother? If it's all elective, why bother anyhow? So we've got some real barriers to effective engagement. Now, we also just took, just very briefly, a look at where some of us are coming from, because this is not about finding blame or fault. We're really a product of how we were socialized and the professional groups with which we are a part. And so, I think many doctors, most doctors I know, were really socialized in the belief that autonomy in the service of quality is really core. I take on the responsibility and then I make the best decision for what's right for this particular patient. And so this all comes about in what it's been referred to actually by a British sociologist as the hidden curriculum, socialized through a hidden curriculum. There's little, if any, evidence that, that there's real appreciation for other members of the team. And then even alignment for synergy, that whole idea about I'm going to work with an effective team, or what one person's called effective teaming, it really runs counter to the core identity, which is I am the individual, I take the responsibility, and therefore I have the right to make those autonomous decisions. So that's certainly not consistent with really feeling engaged and responsible for moving an entire unit forward. Now, managers, as we said the last time, contribute also to unhelpful behaviors. There's plenty to go around because often they look at that behavior with confusion, the behavior I just described, as confusion, disappointment, frustration, resentment, and sometimes they'll even result to judgments and threats. And, that doesn't actually contribute then to doctors coming to the table ready to really be effective partners. So in conclusion, doctor engagement is a function of how doctors and managers respond, and you can see there that beautiful picture of the ice skaters. They're in a dynamic, and so years of specific behaviors become ingrained as a pattern, and so it almost becomes like a ritual dance. We know what the behaviors are going to be or what the response will be, and yet we go through the motions. And that predictable aspect is really a killer from the enthusiasm of really getting engaged in a meaningful way. And as I think we talked about the last time, the only way out of that is really for us all to take responsibility for whatever's happened in the past and say, okay, not blame. We are the product of our socialization and our history and our past experiences. But now, given the urgency for better care to be provided, more efficient care to be provided, we have to acknowledge now we need to really start fresh with our relationships. Now, we said last time, and we went over this very quickly at the end, and I think this is kind of critical. Clarifying what engagement means is really, really important, because engagement for some can mean I want to have my input there, and when I give my input, I want to see that being the answer. And others may say, well, when we ask you for your engagement, we're going to take ideas in, but the executives will ultimately decide. And so we really have to be clear, what does engagement mean to you? And then you and all of your partners, all of the doctors and other colleagues and managers, if we're talking about coming to an agreement about a decision and we're going to have some engagement, what do we mean by engagement? Who's going to decide? What will be the basis of those decisions? And that brings me then to this second point I want to make, which is we really should be applying and using the principles of fair process whenever possible. Because I think when we talk about engaging people and making a decision, it will be different for different decisions. Sometimes it will just be advice. Sometimes it might be really turning over the decision. But the real critical issue is, how do we make the decision using fair process? So I want to just take a minute and explain this to you. And I think as I do, you'll hear it as something different than what we normally do. So I'm now citing an article from the Harvard Business Review, and the citation is there on the bottom of that slide. And one of the quotes from that article goes like this. When asking people for their input, what matters to them is the outcome, that they get what they want, but no more than the fairness of the process that produced them, than they produced a particular outcome. So what is this fair process, and how do we define it in a way so that in the end, if we don't get what our desire was, we can still feel that the decision was fair? And I think I mentioned last time, I think with doctors, fairness is a critical issue. If we know that there's been no politics, it's been a transparent process, okay, we didn't get what we wanted, but there's a rationale, I don't like it, but I can move on, I can accept it and be productive, that's what's desired here. Not making everyone happy all the time, but at least feeling that there was transparency and fairness. And so here's the basics of fair process. Up front, we want to have clear boundaries and know what the boundaries are for what's open for input and modification and what are the absolute givens and what's unmutable. Because I think if we ask doctors, or anyone for that matter, to spend their time providing us with input, and then we don't actually have the opportunity for that to really be used because the decision around that particular element was already made, it's no wonder then that people say, I'm not going to bother with that again. So let's be clear, let's be honest about what can be modified, what's on the table, and what's not. And then who's going to be making the final decision? Whoever, the chief executive, a clinical director, a committee, maybe the group as a whole will have an opportunity to make some decisions. But who up front needs to be known. And then I think all the areas and opportunities where input is needed and will be very important. So identifying, kind of where are the opportunities for input? If we said what was off the table, what's on the table? And as we make the decision, and this is really important, thinking ahead, what criteria will be applied when we're judging the merits of the decision? Will it be cost? Will that be the only thing? Will it be rapidity to getting results? Will it be ease of use in the end? Whatever those criteria will be, so that when people are providing their input during the engagement process, they will know what to speak to. And so they'll really feel empowered to affect the decision. Now, and also communicating all the ways in which input might be provided. So it might be meetings, but I think we all know that meetings, when many of us are working at different times of the day or cannot get away from meetings, there needs to be other things. So there could be blogs or other ways of collecting information or opinions through electronic means. There can be, certainly like we're doing today, there can be conference phone calls so people don't have to be all in the same place. But there are many ways of collecting it, but we need to be sure that there's enough variety so that everyone has the opportunity to participate. Now, after collecting the input and making the decision, here's the step I think we often don't go through, getting back to everyone and explaining the rationale for those who gave the input. Why was this a decision? How did we apply the criteria that we set up front would be applied to come to the decision we came to? And that is absolutely critical for building trust in the decision, for building ownership of that decision, and therefore building commitment to being involved in the next time around. And then finally, and this is a critical part, once that decision is made, if it means a change in behavior, if it means doing things differently, let's go about implementing that decision, training people with what needs to happen, providing them with accountability. And by accountability, as we talked about last time, at the very least, it's providing people with feedback when they're doing it, and for those who aren't, it's frequent feedback about what the expectations are, because it requires a new expectation. If this decision requires a new expectation, and we expect people to be continuing to be involved in future decisions and being engaged in helping us with the quality agenda, they have to see that there will be some accountability once there has been a fair process. Now, with that in mind, I want to move on to some new material today, and the topic I wanted to talk about during this session has to do with the whole issue of being sure we are aligned before we ask people to be engaged. In fact, this phrase, alignment precedes engagement, is a phrase we picked up when working in England from some of our colleagues there. And I think it sounds pretty simple, but it's pretty profound. If I expect you to be engaged, you need to know that we are aligned on a common destination. Otherwise, you might not choose to be engaged. If our personal aims are not aligned with the trust, why would one invest the time or effort in something that's not important? Now, specifically, I want you to be thinking about yourself. I mean, I've often heard clinicians say, I view my own quality as good. Why would I invest in the Trust Improvement Initiative given how busy I am? And I think that's a place where you really have to think, because as we'll talk about, no matter how good an individual's quality is, for the overall trust to improve its quality means everybody putting their issues on the table, the way they do things on the table, and trying to come up with a more standard approach, which can then allow for more efficient use of resources and a much safer execution of whatever the operational issue is. So doctors engage when quality improvement is their priority, not only the trust, and that's the alignment issue. So again, quality is often a trust priority, but not widely shared, particularly if I hold up the mirror and say, I am doing quality. And so investing time and attention to getting everyone on the same page about why improvement's needed and some of what it takes around the standardization is critical to moving forward. So this idea about spending time getting aligned is not a touchy-feely exercise. It's not a luxury. It's critical if we expect doctors to truly engage in care improvement, which then becomes a communal activity, not just an individual sport, so to speak. So quality, as we all know, is the product of a system. It's improving quality is not a solo sport. And I just used a sports analogy on the slides to make a point. It's not a solo sport. So again, I mean, and this is not to take anything away from highly skilled clinicians who do stellar delivery of care all the time, but the fact of the matter is, in the end, if the patient had a quality outcome, it's more than just the work of the individual clinician. And so we've got to be able to look at it that way, be open to the comments from others, and engaging a much broader group who now would be aligned to work on a problem or an issue where we think there really is opportunity for improvement. Now, moving along then with this idea about being aligned, we talk about this sense of a common purpose. And I'm going to read this. I just want you to think about, does this sound like your trust? Common purpose is a force you can almost feel. It animates great companies and great movements, and it can be summoned to propel a politician forward. When cared for, nurtured, and protected, this idea of common purpose produces an almost palpable sense of we that can be felt inside a company. It is the feeling we are all in this together, that we all know and understand what we do, why we're here, and what we stand for. Now, that is a propelling kind of a feeling in an organization. And you know, you think about what a trust is doing and the individual commitments of clinicians toward that goal of quality, it seems like it would be a simple matter. But I think it requires a shift in mindset, and that's the mindset of it's not just an individual's role, it's a team's role. It takes a team to really produce outstanding quality. And so this aligning around this common purpose of improving quality and doing everything we can to minimize harm to patients is really critical as an initial step, because it really is countercultural. Because if care improvement is not a part of the trust common purpose, commonly defined, commonly understood, what we get is people doing their own thing, all being committed, but having a different sense of what the priorities are, or having a different sense of what it would take to improve quality. So those who want to engage in improvement do, and those who don't go their own way. And I don't know about your trust, but that's really what I see in most institutions. There are committed people who do the work and stay committed, remarkably so, but there are many who just don't choose to get engaged and feel that they in a sense, from the self perspective, I'm doing quality, and again, but in many ways, really, I think, way sub-optimizing the efforts of the trust and really making it much less optimal in the end. So a common aim, no matter what we call this thing, is bigger than oneself. And I don't want people to get hung up about the term, but it helps everyone engage in quality when it's a part of a clear overarching aim that is compelling and larger than personal needs or the agenda. And you can call that aim a common purpose, a shared destination, a shared vision, a picture where we're all headed together. I don't care what you call it. I know the V word, shared vision, sometimes is viewed as touchy-feely or overused or used in a way where it hasn't been applied in a way that's been effective in the past. So you use your own term, but what I was talking about is this overarching aim that we all share, and it's around this issue of advancing the quality agenda. Now, as I've just implied, but many doctors view the vision work as touchy-feely, kind of kumbaya work. But most vision statements oftentimes are not powerful, and so I don't blame the doctors. They're not unique. They're not strategic. They're not useful. They're often feel-good statements. And if the visioning exercise is undertaken as just a paper and pencil exercise to get something out, but lacking in-depth conversation, the opportunity for this deeper adaptive work is lost. You might recall when we were together about a month ago, we talked about the difference between adaptive and technical work. Adaptive work is getting to the more emotional side of the work. If doctors are going to move from this individual orientation, I am the keeper of quality, and recognize and accept the fact that it's a communal activity, it's a team activity, that's adaptive work. It requires doctors in some ways to change their relationship to quality, their relationship to colleagues, in some ways their professional identity. So if we rush through this vision conversation with a 5-minute paper and pencil exercise, it will be meaningless. Because underneath, there will be questions, and there will be the need to let go of some old stereotype understanding. So I ask you to think about and realize the power of shared vision, but the most important thing is how to then, quote unquote, realize it, how to make it real in an organization. And I think it all starts with, and this is the critical first step in my experience, doctors developing a deep appreciation of just how interdependent they are with their colleagues and everyone else in the organization to get to the quality agenda, to address the quality issues, to improve the safety. And I think people have to look at that and really critically examine the assumption, if we're all good doctors and we all work hard, there is no problem, to really looking at the realities of today. Because if we are then interdependent, then sharing a vision would be important. But first, we've got to identify that it is an important activity, not just a make-work kind of an exercise. The process to develop the vision then deepens the understanding of the new world of what we might call in America market forces. But there are market forces or community forces, but the forces are going to shape who comes to your trust. The forces are going to shape what kind of budgets you have to spend. And the forces are going to really change and influence the expectations of patients. And you really, when we're developing that shared vision of what we're about here, we want to encourage different points of view to be heard, and that real conversation that will build commitment. The vision is meant to be strategic and granular, not just a feel-good statement. And while it should be a stretch from where we are now, and we should know where we are now and what a stretch would really look like, but not a fantasy. And then if it's going to be meaningful, and this is critical if we're going to maintain the belief of doctors that this was a worthwhile activity, we're going to have to translate that vision into actionable strategies. We're going to have to measure and report progress and keep it on the front burner. And when we think about our budgets and our resources, thinking about how do we align those resources with our quality agenda. And keeping the vision in front of everyone and using it to make decisions and, as I say, to set priorities. So just in concluding this section, I think when we're talking about engaging doctors, it is critical not to overlook this step. Because if doctors don't share the trust vision or the shared purpose, it's not going to happen. And so we've got to begin those conversations. And they will take time. But clarify with executives and clinical leaders the price paid if there is not a shared vision that includes quality. And not just on words and on paper, but shared in the heart, shared in the identity of what brings us to work every day. And based on what we think is happening in our trust today, discusses it worth investing the time for deep conversation so that we can be aligned around the vision of quality and whatever other factors are important to the success of your trust. But not a superficial understanding of quality, but what does it really look like and mean to us? And find language that resonates if it's not shared vision. Call it whatever you like. Actually, I find that just to share what I tend to use, I tend to think about a shared destination. If it were so many years from now, we all ended up in the place that we'd really want to be, what would that look like? And I think that's fine. But whatever it is that works for you. And then, again, I want to emphasize, starting off with doctors discovering their interdependence for delivering good quality care and for them having fulfilling careers. That's an important place to start so that the vision work is not work in search of a purpose, but we clearly see the need, and then we operate from that basis. Okay. Ruth, I think I'm ready for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jack. I think we're starting to get some questions in. Can I encourage everyone to get typing and put forward their questions? Perhaps I could just kick off with one. On the shared vision, as you say, it could seem quite a touchy-feely sort of concept. Do you have specific examples where approaching it in a slightly different way has really captured people's imaginations? Any real star moments when?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to tell you, this is an actual true story, and I know many of you, I don't know if you have, Ruth, but many of you have probably heard the story of a health center where it's a group practice of doctors, about 450, 500 doctors in the Pacific Northwest, out in Seattle, Washington, Virginia Mason Medical Center, where for about 14 years now they have been on a very rigorous quality journey, very focused and from year to year. And they started off with this issue of developing a shared vision among the clinicians and everybody in the organization. Now, the words, you know, it's really interesting. The words are very simple, and it could be trite and meaningless. But the background was they spent the better part of a year coming to an understanding of what those words meant. And they have really gone way downstream in terms of really some stellar work and quality. They got an award about maybe 3 or 4 years ago being the hospital for the decade in the United States, and that had to do with their quality results. And their vision is simply to be the quality leader, but not the quality leader in Seattle and not in Washington and not even in the United States. But they had the gumption to say we were going to be the quality leader wherever in the world, and they've set that as their vision. Now they've behind all that, they've learned a method for improvement, they've aligned their budget and so forth. So the words are not as important as the dialogue that precedes coming to the words, but because that really has meaning to people. And I can tell you, you can go into that organization and ask literally anybody I have, from a surgeon to someone who's a porter, and they'll tell you what the vision of the place is and what their role is. Yep, it's all defined.
Okay. Thanks for that. We'll take one more question now, and then we'll take a few more after the next session. So the second question: doesn't the painting of a picture of the future destination have to be a leadership, a sort of executive board level role? But then could this be interpreted as forced engagement rather than alignment? Okay. How do you generate that first picture, I guess?
Right. So I think first of all, I mean, you know, I think the idea of a shared vision, it does, if we're going to own it, we have to feel like it wasn't just handed down to us. So one of the things I think is important, just that I'm not sure I made this clear earlier, if we are going to engage our doctors and others, managers and others in this discussion, and I think that some of them could be around the table with the board, or the board could come to several listening sessions with people so that they absorb what the doctors and others are thinking. There are ways for the board to get that input early on, and I think it would be far better to get the input early on than to try to sell it and push it later, because, because not only is it going to be much more difficult, but I firmly believe that the board would be well informed by listening to the doctors and managers and others in the organization. But the thing that I think is critically important is, prior to asking everyone for their opinion, are we convinced that the people really understand the current performance of the organization? How does our quality stack up? How does our cost structure stack up? And what is coming down for us in terms of future budgets that might imply that we've got to maintain or improve quality with less money? Do we all have what I tend to call business literacy, so that the vision is predicated on reality? Because the worst thing in the world is to ask doctors and others for their opinion about the vision and then reject it because people feel like it's out of touch with reality. Up front, we should be educating people so they share with us their aspirations and ideas for vision in the context of what is real. I think that's absolutely critical. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jack. We've got a couple more comments which are about, the challenge of having this broad vision and how it actually really captures the issues and purposes and values within an enormous organization. But I suggest we move on to your second part, and then we'll pick up some more questions.
I would just say to all of that, it is real work. That's why when people have, like, this one meeting and the flip chart comes out, and we spend about 15 minutes coming up with a cute phrase, and then we spend about 45 minutes wordsmithing it, it doesn't hold water. And I think that's what leads people to being cynical. So, when I said that they spent the better part of a year at Virginia Mason doing this work, they spent the better part of a year. I mean, I will stop after this one other comment. When they do their strategic planning at Virginia Mason on an annual basis, there the executives do come up with, they think, what the goals will be for the next year. But they spend, I think, maybe 4 months or more playing what's called catch-ball, in the sense that they'll put it out, they'll have groups of people respond to those goals, they'll get it back, they'll modify, put them out, get it back. So I think in large, complex organizations, we need to develop the mechanisms or processes to engage people in ways in which they actually feel engaged, most importantly, because they actually have the opportunity to influence some of the thinking and decision-making. So I think we've got to really think creatively in these large, complex organizations. How do we give people that sense of being involved? And by spending enough time, lead time, to do it effectively, in the end, it makes things much more efficient. Because when people have ownership, you can see just the progress and the velocity of making progress is really advanced. Okay, with that said, I know I'm supposed to move on, so I will. And this, Bruce, is the topic that you were referring to, the role of clinical leadership, doctor leadership in doctor engagement. What is the role of doctor leaders? And my first comments are really going to be about doctors who have the formal role. They have the title, the clinical director, the chief officer, whatever the titles are in your particular trust. What are the roles of those people in engagement? Toward the end, I will make some comments about the informal leaders or the champions, but right now I want to talk about the formal leaders, both being important, but a different role. So I think it's really critical that we understand that doctor leadership is really critical as a facilitator for doctor engagement, but it's not an easy role to fill. It's a very challenging role to fill in any trust I've ever been in. And I think it's because it's for several reasons. Oftentimes we're putting people into what I consider to be incredibly challenging jobs with very little opportunity for their development. We know that doctors value their autonomy almost as one of the highest professional values. And I've often said that when doctors look for leadership in the morning, when they're up in the morning and looking at themselves in the bathroom mirror, that's where they find leadership, looking at themselves. There's not this sense of a need for an outsider to do that. If anything, maybe to go out there and communicate to others in the organization for us, as we'll talk about, getting us resources, but not directing me or providing me with any kind of leadership. That's a personal thing. I have my own ethics and my own drive. So, and then this idea about, is one of us elevated and then the rest of us are what, followers? Are we lowlifes? Are we sheep that are going to be led someplace? I mean, I think most doctors would say, okay, a leader, fine, go to the meetings. But as one doctor actually literally said to me, but not 1 millimeter above. We're all the same. Flat, talk about a flat organization. And so there isn't a strong tradition of leaders, doctor leaders, who advocate for change. Now, you know, the leaders are often highly respected doctors, but if you argue for change, I mean, you could really be seen as, you know, becoming a suit or going to the dark side. We all have, and by the way, you know, I was much surprised when I did the work in England to find that all the phrases we use for doctor leaders when they, you know, when they become really, in a sense, convinced that there are certain changes that need to be made, we all have the same terms, dark side, you know, suits, all the same. And so it's very difficult for these people because then they become ostracized and isolated from their own peers, which professionally is pretty painful. So, I mean, so as a result, I think doctors' view of these formal leaders is pretty narrow. You know, we like it when they advocate for us, you know, advocate our position. Surely that's good. They protect us, sometimes from bad change, but sometimes from needed change. They communicate what those upstairs are thinking, and we want them certainly to communicate upwards about the things that we think we need in terms of resources. But as I said, first among equals, not a millimeter above. So, you know, it comes down to, as it was phrased to me many years ago, the best leaders are those who go out and get us the resources and then get them, management, to leave us alone, protect us from change. After all, we're clinicians, we know what we're doing, just get us the resources and we'll be just ducky, just fine. And that's been reinforced for quite some time. And you know, I mean, as I understand, at least in England, the health service, I mean, that really was the way it was set up. The government provided the money, and the doctors really did all the setting of how work would happen, all the clinical work would happen. And so, you know, there's a tradition that that's the way it would be. And of course, now we're looking at the value of professional management, but it comes hard for doctors, I think, to really accept the fact that there's value in that. So this idea about the role of the leader is to get the resources and get us to leave them alone is really deeply embedded. Now, you know, I just want to be clear about why I say that doctor engagement is so dependent on, I think, having effective leadership. First of all, as we, you know, this whole idea about not an individual doctor viewing their work, viewing quality is important, but the individual doctor really seeing that they're part of a team, that quality is a process, as a product of a system. That is adaptive change. It requires letting go of a certain way of thinking. I mean, again, professional identity, I think, for doctors is deeply embedded. And I think to really accept the idea of we are going to work together to improve quality and moving toward a standard way of delivering care, that is adaptive change. And therefore, oftentimes raises anxiety, and people feel like, well, that's to be avoided. And so when we talked about Ron Heifetz in our initial session together, one of the points that he makes is when this kind of work needs to be done, the role of the leader is to bring people to the work, not let them escape and let them go off because they're anxious, but bring them to the work. And so we need a clear voice from the respected doctor who says, I believe we need to do this, and here's why. It's really critical that that respected person speak up and really put their issues and their thoughts on the table. And then people can express and they can talk about their concerns and their warnings about this, but at least now we've got people to engage. Getting them to show up is really about 80% of the battle. Now, when the doctor leader doesn't say, I believe we need to do this, but he says, I went to this meeting and they say we need to do this, while it protects the leader from the hostility, you know, I'm just a spokesperson, I don't necessarily believe this, it really is the kiss of death for change. Because then what it basically says is, you know, you don't believe it, the leader doesn't believe it, therefore I don't need to believe it, and therefore we don't need to get on with it, and this thing that's painful, this adaptive change, I can kind of forget about it. So I think one of, for me, the requirements for effective clinical leadership is a tremendous amount of courage. The courage to really be in touch with what you believe and the courage to take the heat from your colleagues when they push back, because I think, again, it's not they don't care about quality, but as we're defining it today, I think it's a different picture. So I think that clinical leaders, in my view, are often caught in the middle. You know, the trust needs doctor leaders to sponsor change. And when I say sponsor change, it's that I believe, not somebody else. It's wrapping your professional identity and your credibility and saying, I believe we need to do this. You're in the chain of command and you're putting your reputation on the line. That's what the trust needs from the doctor leaders. But as we know, doctors don't necessarily accept the legitimate authority of leaders. You know, we're not 1 millimeter above. You know, we're all the same. You know, you go to the meetings, but we're all the same. And so you can see what that leads to is this poor leader caught in the middle. And those arrows that are colliding, from my point of view, is really it's kind of like the head of the leader right in there, feeling it from both sides. And that's really untenable. And that's why oftentimes these jobs go wanting. People don't want to do it because there's no sense that one can be successful. And I do believe, and this is critical, that no doctor leader will ever be more successful than the people he's trying to lead are willing to let him or her be. It's really critical, therefore, that the leaders have to bring the doctors onto the idea about why having effective leadership is critical for them, and we'll be talking about that in just a second, because doctors have to consciously choose to have their leaders be effective, which means that they're accepting that the leaders are legitimate and have authority. When the group can't decide, that leader will decide. If there are people in the group who are not complying to what we all agreed to do, they will be given feedback. They will be given help. Not about punishment, at least not for the longest while, but they have the authority and the responsibility to hold everyone to account. If I change, what about the other people? So that's the kind of a new leadership that we're really talking about. But for leaders, if we come from the place of, you know, basically, you know, this idea about, you know, they're all the kind of the same and first among equals, and this idea about you go out and get the resources, and then as a leader, I see my job as basically the messenger, and not much around this issue that I've just talked about around accountability. How do I get my head around a different way of viewing it? Because, you know, you can get, and I've seen this, doctor leaders going off and getting lots of education and training, and getting 100% on the test, you know, brilliant, and learn it all. But when they come back into the old environment, they become the old leader, which is not going to necessarily move the agenda forward because the mindset has not shifted. This is really, talk about adaptive change, and the courage, this is what it's about. So a colleague of ours, quite famous in the States, is now emeritus from MIT, is really one of the deepest thinkers, I would say, on leadership in general. He talks about, at a time like this, where an organization or a profession or an industry, for that matter, is going through this kind of really tectonic plates kind of change, leadership now is the ability to step outside the culture that created the leader to start evolutionary change processes that are more adaptive. Don't look to the past. We've got to, okay, that was fine. Understand that the way we are as leaders today is dictated by the culture. It's the expectations people have of us. If we step outside it, we're kind of punished. And so the culture has become the trap. We need to step outside that culture. And I think the only way we really do this is by developing a cadre of clinical leaders who are committed to moving forward in a different way so we can learn and support each other. Otherwise, I think it's really, really difficult to do this within one's own mind. Now, what does this new leader do? I think that's a legitimate question. Well, first of all, they're going to sponsor change. And when I say about sponsoring change and engaging colleagues, they're going to demonstrate their personal commitment to quality and safety. And that's going to be both in public and in private. It's not going to be different in the car park when you're walking around with a colleague than what you say in front of your colleagues in a big meeting. And being a role model, being the first, learning how to do the thing and demonstrating that it can be done and the value of doing it and having positive stories to tell. And providing encouragement and acknowledgement to those who get on, even if it's not perfect, really supporting people who do. But holding colleagues accountable to engage in the organization's quality and safety initiatives. Holding them accountable to engage, to show up, to try, to come to education, not to be perfect. And when they don't, it's the reminder, and it's the reminder, and it's again the feedback and the reminder, so that they get the message that there is no escape. We're going to be around, and we're going to continue to talk about it. And their colleagues are counting on them. And if the doctor leader is finding that maybe they've become a broken record, there may be other colleagues that they really respect who can go and have informal conversation with them. But there's no escape. That's got to be the message. Now, in addition, I think it's really important, beyond the sponsoring the change and holding colleagues accountable, I think it's critical, I think, that this doctor leader also focus on making practice life more efficient, more sustainable for their clinical colleagues. Because as we ask them to take on new responsibilities, the workflows and so forth do need to be addressed. And as we'll talk about, I think aligning, therefore, with managers, other managers of the department to help make that happen is going to be critical. And then the other thing that I think is so important in this expanded definition is that what their colleagues have to understand is only when a leader can make commitments on their behalf and know that they are knowing that the people that he's leading are sufficiently aligned, that when he makes that commitment, that he can actually fulfill it. Only then will people in the organization, the doctors in the organization, truly feel empowered to really affect where the organization is going and to how decisions get made. Because I think it's absolutely critical to acknowledge that from the executive's perspective, what's so important when they're surrounded by a group of senior leaders is whoever's making it from whatever department, when they say we're going to deliver, they know they're going to deliver. And I think when you have a senior medical leader saying we're going to do this, we're going to deliver, I think what's often heard is they're going to do the best they can. But if the doctors in the department understood how that undermines the credibility of doctors and the value of that input, they begin to see how important it is that they align around their leader, have the discussions when we're going to make a decision. But once we've committed, that the leader then is able to keep those commitments, that's what will elevate doctors' influence on the organization in big and insignificant ways. So, but I wanted to just do two quick things, and then we're going to go to questions. But we have, as I said, not just the formal leaders that we've been talking about, who are part of a hierarchy and critically important for all the reasons we've talked about, but also, what I've also implied, these informal leaders who are highly connected and respected peers. And so at times, I might, as the formal leader, be seen as just too much a part of the hierarchy. And then what's so important is someone who is a colleague who I know and trust comes to me and says, actually, I've tried it and it works. It makes life better. These champions, they lead by example. And they really have the potential to be highly influential, particularly because often the distrust that doctors have for doctors who take on formal appointments, these informal leaders can be so important. And they do not have to be zealots or even early adopters, but just people who can speak from experience. Now, so what can you do now? And this is my final slide. I think it's really important that you convene a group of doctor leaders in your trust to assess their willingness and ability to sponsor change, to be out in front. And now some of you may be saying, well, it all depends on the change. So think about the changes that your trust is trying to promote right now. What's the barrier for being able to sponsor that change? And think about the amount of courage required. Think about whatever it is you need, whether it's about being able to balance that with getting something to the doctors to making their practice more efficient. But what are the barriers, and once we address those barriers, can we move forward and say we will sponsor change and apply the definitions, those behaviors that I just outlined before? I think it's also important in the trust, and I don't know where you're all at, that leadership be a real job with time and pay commensurate with the responsibilities and the goals you're trying to meet. And I think it's really important as you try to strengthen clinical leadership that you engage your colleagues and talk about why having strong leadership is critical to their own ongoing success and professional satisfaction and fulfillment. And I think that may take more than one conversation because it's not intuitively obvious when people come in with old attitudes. But I think if they can really begin to be challenged on that, they begin to see why supporting leadership is critical. Not totalitarian leadership, leadership that engages, that makes transparent decisions, that applies fair process, all the things we've talked about. And then I think, again, helping this leader make practice life better, more efficient for colleagues is really important. And that means, this is the last thing I would say, that this issue of really having stronger and more effective clinical leadership really requires that the entire management team see this as a value and can unite around our clinical leaders to help them really be effective in delivering something that's important to their colleagues. It's got to be an entire executive team that gets behind this idea of developing clinical leadership. It's absolutely critical. So with that, I think I've blabbed on long enough.
Thank you very much, Jack. We're going to take a few questions. There's a couple from the earlier session. One question was around the time to engage, and it almost feels like you need a marketing team. The point you were making was that it's 4 months a year. So it's
when I gave that example, that was where they were setting goals for the next year. They got a strategic plan, and then they set annual goals. And 4 months ahead of the time of actually delivering on it, saying what those goals are going to be, it may even be more than 4 months, but it's at least that. What they do is they really go in this iterative process by generating and putting it out there for comment, and then generating, modifying, and putting it up. That's 4 months before they achieve their clarity around their annual goals. Was that the question? Why is it only 4 months? I thought that was the question. Are you there, Ruth?
I think it was the question about you need marketing teams to help you do it, and it's a huge endeavour.
Okay.
I think the point is that it's actually a large part of the day job, isn't it?
It is a large part. I think marketing or communications people inside an organization, they can help you. They can help you, but there's no substitute for the face-to-face conversations between clinicians. But I think the marketing people can help you think about appropriate venues and how you use your venues. But this is a real leadership activity to engage people in these kinds of conversations. Again, so I think it's partnering with communications experts and internal marketers is very important, and I would take every advantage of using them, but you can't substitute the actual leadership for that.
And you've talked a lot about doctors, the question about involving doctors who work across specialties who may have really, really different interests, and also across professional boundaries, nursing, other healthcare staff. Any observations?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. So I'm talking about doctors today, so my comments were limited to doctors. I think this idea of different specialties discovering they have a common agenda is absolutely is important. And because, you know, I think actually the issues of quality and quality improvement, at least in the States, and that's really obviously where I have most of my experience, I think for a lot of others in the hospital, you know, I think it's an easier sell. It's the doctors who feel like it's always been their agenda. It's a redefined agenda. That's more difficult. I think it's interesting. I don't know if I don't think I told you the story on the first call, but I once did a retreat with 24 orthopedic surgeons that had a common practice. And I'll never forget this. We were talking about some issues that were very important to them, and one of them said, very boldly to me, kind of strident, he said, he said, we have nothing in common. I almost fell off my seat, you know. So you talk about different specialties feeling they don't share a common vision. These were 24 orthopedic surgeons, subspecialists at that, feeling that they didn't share a common agenda. So I think, yes, but it's the common aim that really needs to be brought out, because it may look different in orthopedics than it might in cardiology, but this vision is really, in the end, what are we all trying to do together? And it's the core. It may get defined differently by different specialties, for sure. But what at the core is the common nugget here? That's what's got to be discovered. Because if we don't have a common nugget, how do we ever work in synergy? How do we ever integrate and coordinate care in a way that's going to be better for patients? How do we ever allocate resources in ways that are really going to optimize moving forward at a time when resources are scarce and the disease burden is growing? So I think this is a really important decision. And people, I think, again, have to discover that without it, we're paying a price, a wicked price.
Jack, I'm going to put you another couple of questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Alan to take the session forward, just to wrap up and maybe take one or two more. I think there's a concern that there's too much to do at once. Whilst you have that sort of core common purpose, there's so many improvement priorities, it's really difficult. Should people narrow it down or try and keep it broad? That was one. And the second one is, are we really doing enough for the junior doctors, the people who are training? What can senior leaders do to help them get more involved in this? And thank you, I'm going to sign out at that point.
Okay, so let me say a couple of things about the number of different different agenda items going on at once. I think in a way that is why the shared vision work is so critical. In the absence of shared vision, what people see is just one change or one initiative after another with nothing tying them together, which I think leads to burnout, change burnout very, very quickly. I think if we at least see we're trying to get to a destination and all these things we're doing are additive or even synergistic in getting us toward that destination, that helps a lot. So I think that this having a common, if you will, kind of vessel to hold all this in is really, really important. As far as the junior doctors are concerned, one thing I'd say is that senior doctors have to really watch what they say, because I think the junior doctors are socialized by what they see above them. And if we see senior doctors trash talking, so to speak, the idea of having time to really discover what's important to all of us and how we're going to move forward together, then we've got another generation of doctors who have kind of been contaminated by this kind of old way of thinking. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think it's important to really discover that a lot of these junior doctors, at least I know this in the States, they do long for a common goal. It's interesting. It's kind of like a throwback. I never thought I would live to see it, but you hear younger doctors, at least now these are doctors that are out in practice, not still in training, but maybe out in practice less than 5 years, talking about their frustration working in an organization where there is no common vision or common goal, and wondering why there isn't, because it feels to them like they're lost, and they're looking for more of a kind of a sense of direction and common purpose. So I think they have a lot to contribute, the young doctors do, but I think they're only going to contribute if it's safe for them to. And if the role models are saying it's not worth doing or don't bother with it, then we're going to have snuffed out the very energy that we need. So I think we have to be really conscious of that.
Thank you, Jack. That's really great, and it's lovely to hear you, as ever, completely energized and so insightful on this issue. A quick extra question, if I may, which is, what about managers actually working within clinical settings and embedding them? Is that another way of ensuring engagement? Matt Wyatt's asking about, when he was a directorate manager, he found himself taking sides and actually working with clinicians and keeping the bosses at bay. So would this kind of embedding and sharing of culture be a good way to ensure?
Absolutely. First of all, I mean, that we see each other more commonly, so we can't hide out. I mean, there's just that reality. But also, it's like when I have firsthand experience of the impact of a decision, it's infinitely different than a number on a page. And so I think, yes, and then you have relationship, because there's always going to be give and take. But if I have relationship, it's so much easier to have those challenging conversations. So I think, yes, I think the manager, now, I know at times doctors may want to meet alone to talk about whether it's clinical issues or whatever there is, that's fine. I mean, they can have their executive session. But I think that when they're having the run-of-the-mill business meeting where they're talking about improving the operation, to do it without the clinical manager in the room, I think is extraordinarily wasteful and really undermining, because I think then then this manager doesn't know, did they talk about the issue or were they talking about me? Was it personal? I think we've really got to kind of really mature to the point where we're really able to have those conversations together. Now, I was assuming when you asked that question that the manager was a professional manager, not a physician, not a doctor, I should say.
That's correct. That's correct. You assumed correctly. Jack, thank you very much. That's been a brilliant hour. It's flown by, and I've had the luxury of listening to you and Ruth and thoroughly enjoying it. So we're looking forward to the next session, but can I just say thank you and wish you all the very best over there in Cambridge. I heard three very clear points that came to me as you were speaking. One was developing the vision and alignment is real work. It's not just something you do as tokenism, and you will get back what you pay, what you invest. The second one, I saw a lovely description, which was about true leadership and engagement, which is about belief. It's not just about taking people's messages from one room to another and not believing them, and being able to speak with credibility. So if you say that something will happen, it will actually happen, and those are great ways to describe leadership. And I think that the third point, which I've seen abused when clinicians are brave enough to go forward for clinical leadership roles, are they actually supported properly for all the inevitable issues that they will face? So those were great issues, and you'll see on your screens that the next session is on the 8th of August. It will be chaired on this occasion by our Chief Executive in Cardiff and the Vale, Adam Cairns. He's a great practitioner of many of the principles which Jack describes, and it will be a great way to finish the three sessions. So can I thank you all for your participation and ask you also to feedback on the session in the usual way when it asks you for your comments. So thank you, and look forward to hearing from you, Jack, next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.